Hello, this is Curtis with Pragmatic Agile, and I'd like to help you reduce the suck. Hello, welcome back. Today, we're going to focus on velocity, what it is, how you calculate it, and why you really need to master this concept before you interview for a Scrum Master job. We'll go through this fairly quickly. Okay, so what is velocity? Velocity is defined as the observed average completed story points. So you just take the total number of points that were completed in any sprint, and you add it up for the number of sprints you're going to calculate, and you divide it by the number of sprints. So for this example, in sprint 1, we completed 25 points. Sprint 2, we completed 30 points. Sprint 3, we completed 35 points. If you add them up and divide by 3, you get 30 for your velocity. Seems very simple, right? I want you to note that a mediocre Scrum Master always knows current sprint velocity average. I'm not saying that it's not good for you to know it. I'm saying you have to know it. It's expected for you to know it. But knowing your current sprint velocity doesn't make you a great Scrum Master. Doesn't even make you a good one. It just makes you mediocre. It's a basic expectation. You should know what your team velocity is. Is that in the Scrum Guide? No. If you're using Scrum, you're using story points, you're calculating velocity. At any time when somebody says, hey, what is your team's current velocity? You should be able to answer this question. A good Scrum Master is aware of your team velocity, but also knows whether or not the trend is up or down. This is the person that I would expect to be able to say, what is your current velocity? 30 points. What is the trend? We've been increasing or we've been decreasing. Now, if I say, why are you decreasing? And you go, I don't know. I'd have to get with the team and try and figure out what's going on. Okay, so you're pretty good, but you're not great. A great Scrum Master would be able to say, we're increasing because we're starting to see the benefits of the automation tests, or we're decreasing because the team is learning how to write automation and learning how to work with some of the automation tools, building CI/CD, whatever the reason is why your velocity would be decreasing. That is an indicator of somebody who goes beyond just the bare minimum information and now can start making sense and bringing some type of additional insights into the team. The input for the calculation, I use 3 sprints of completed points. I sum the points and I divide it by the number of sprints, and I show it as a trend. A single sprint sum could be a fluke. Most teams will have several sprints where they do 30 and they do 35 and they do 32 and they do 35. And the next sprint, for some reason, they do 40 or 42. That does not mean that from now on, your new velocity is 42. Very often, they'll go back to that level. There are good reasons why that often happens. Let's not get into that here. Just understand that use the average velocity and don't allow a single excellent sprint or horrible sprint to detract from your message, what your average velocity is. 6 sprints is too long. It doesn't show trends soon enough, in my opinion. I like 3. You'll note that Jira actually shows a 6 sprint trend. How is velocity used? It's a forecasting tool. If somebody asks you, how do you use velocity? You need to say it's a forecasting tool. It's a way of determining how many story points we should bring into the sprint to start with. We call that a target load, or at least I do, the target load. So if I have a 30-point average, I would expect that the product owner shows up with roughly 30 points. Probably a little bit more, maybe 40, and then you negotiate. If you have an average velocity and you have a product owner who says, I want you to do 60, and that's twice your average velocity, you use the velocity as a way of saying, sorry, we have never completed 60 points. There's no way we can complete 60 points. That's overloading the team. We need to make some decisions. You've got to pull some things out. We could try for 30. Maybe the team will say, well, let's try for 35. Okay, 110, 115% of your normal velocity, that's reasonable. But 200, 300% of your average velocity, unreasonable. That's one of the benefits of using velocity, is helping to determine where the cutoff is. And when you say to the product owner, it's too much, it can't handle that. We also use it for forecasting releases. If we know how many points we do in a sprint and we have an initiative, we know how many points are in the initiative. Roughly, it's a forecast, it's an estimate, it's rough. If we have 30 points per sprint and there's 300 points in the initiative, it's probably roughly 10 sprints. So what you want to do is forecast It's 300 points divided by 30. That gives us 10. Let's give it a 2 or 3 sprint buffer. So you might want to report back. Our estimate is between 10 and 13 sprints, 10 and 12 sprints. Give yourself a little buffer. I learned that the hard way. Now here's some do's and don'ts. Do use velocity for planning and forecasting the sprint load. Do use it as a measure of effort, not value. Don't assume that story points equal value. That's a big mistake. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about sprint goals. Velocity can be used to calculate a release date range, but remember, it's just an estimate. It's going to be wrong. It's always wrong. The question is, how wrong? A little wrong is great. A lot wrong kind of sucks. We're going to try and reduce the suck. Okay, now, don't use velocity as a performance metric. You don't use velocity to punish or reward teams. Teams will increase velocity on their own as they acquire skills and get better. Having a boss kicking the team and telling them to increase velocity will guarantee that somebody will gamify this thing. They'll start to game the system and they will begin to manipulate things. All right. We don't do that. Don't use it as a performance metric. Don't use it to penalize teams. Also, it's a bad idea to compare teams. Average velocity is a quick way of stating how much scope we can get into a sprint. Velocity is only used to measure effort, complexity, and risk. If velocity is not a performance metric, what could we use? Well, what about predictability? What is that? You'll notice that the blue column here is what the team predicted they would get done, and the orange column is what they actually got done. So if you look over here, for example, at sprint 1, they got 20 out of 25. If you divide the completed points by the committed points, you'll get a percentage. So for example, 20 divided by 25 equals 80%. So that means they had an 80% accuracy in this sprint. Let's look at the next one. They got 31 out of 30. That's 101%. So this right here, this is a percentage that a complete percentage, what I call predictability. And so if your team regularly is completing 80 to 100%, that is a great indicator of performance, at least from the ability to forecast and to predict at a sprint level. That's all. But it is an important ability. If you can forecast accurately at a sprint level, then you might have a chance of forecasting accurately at a release level. If you cannot predict what you can do in a sprint, then your release forecast is completely suspect. There's no way that you can do that. That's why we need to be able to demonstrate stability at the sprint level more than the release level. Great teams sometimes have to slow down before they can speed up. You've got to be stable and predictable before you can go fast. You know, the Navy SEALs say, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. You need to slow down and learn how to move in a smooth manner, learn how to complete your software with quality before you begin to increase your speed. A lot of executives want to go fast before the team has learned to be smooth and stable and predictable, right? So this is why this metric is very important. So mediocre Scrum Masters will know the current predictability calculation. Yeah, we completed 80% of our scope last time. Great. A good Scrum Master can state a predictability average. On average, we complete 85% or 90%. Over the last 3 sprints, we've completed 90%. And a great Scrum Master can tell you the trend. We're getting better and better because we have taken these steps to improve our predictability. Now, what this also means, guys, is that if you're going to look into predictability, you need to understand what are the things that impact predictability. What are the things that could impact your ability to predict what you can complete in a sprint? It might be the developer's attention to detail. Did they do a good design? Did they really think it out, or did they skip steps? It could be. It could be the quality of the code that they write, and do they generate a lot of defects? It could be that you've got too much work in progress. It could be your testers. It could be data. It could be systems. It could be environments. Might be that you have a lot of churn. That means that once you start the sprint, stuff starts coming in and out. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you have to, at your retrospective, find out what is impacting our ability to predict and complete things. This is how teams get better. Predictability is a very important metric. And the numbers don't lie, nor do they have an opinion. That's what's lovely about these metrics. All right, so what's the data to calculate this? You take the committed points divided by the completed points, all right, and you also end up with the incomplete And then you calculate that for every single individual sprint. But you should also think about calculating it as a trend. Take an average of the last 3, and then you have both the individual percentage completed as well as a predictability trend. Now, as part of this, we need to think about definition of done must be rigidly adhered to here. Okay? What does that mean? It means either the stories are done or they're not. Some teams try to cheat by giving themselves partial credit. This is why I'm talking about splitting. Splitting is yucky. By splitting, what I mean is, let's say it's an 8-point story or a 5-point story, and they started off the sprint, but it didn't get completed. So at the end of the sprint, the developers say, we finished our part, we should get 3 points of credit. But we need to remain clear that a story is only done when it's developed, tested, and approved. Okay? Incomplete stories should not be given partial credit because they could generate more defects, which require additional work. So never split the story and give partial credit. Don't do that. It's either developed, tested, and approved, or the whole thing carries over. In the next sprint, if it's 5 points, even if they say we did 3 points, don't treat it as only 2 points of work. Treat it as a 5 because you don't know how many defects they're going to generate. And I have learned over time, I've measured the effort to fix defects, and repeatedly I have found that on average it takes about 7 hours to fix defects. So when you carry a story over and they have 2 or 3 defects, it might take them a couple of days to fix those. If you're lucky, they get it done in the morning, but it's quite possible it could take them a couple of days. So carry the whole thing over. And if you get done early, if you're ahead of target because it turns out it was easier to finish, great. You pull in some stretch goals. Now, slicing is different than splitting. You have to go watch my video on story slicing and story splitting and how to use points, etc. But slicing is when we use a vertical slice through the functionality. And we plan to break a complex story into little pieces, and we reduce some functionality, or we take out some of the acceptance criteria, or we defer non-functional requirements. This pattern is all right. Slicing is yummy. Splitting is yucky. Remember that. I want you to see this is what a predictability trend could look like. So a predictability trend shows the average ratio of completed to committed. Teams with 80% or greater predictability are stable and demonstrably capable of delivering software sprint over sprint. Predictability at the sprint level increases the likelihood of predictability at the release level. Formula is similar to velocity, but the input is each sprint completion ratio. Note that while individual sprint completion metrics may show swings, the trend shows if the team is getting better or worse over time. So here's what I'm talking about. That's a lot of words, but let's look over here. All right, so now I'm zoomed in here, and I want you to take a look. The orange dotted line is the individual percent complete for each sprint. So in this sprint, they completed 24% of what they targeted. Then they completed 155%. Then they completed 51%. Then they completed 50%. Then 144 and 136, etc. Now you notice that there's big peaks and valleys here, correct? The team is a little unstable. That's something to look for. If you're going from 24 to 150 to 50 to 50 to 144, there's something in here that's not right. The team is not stable and predictable. You need to use the individual completion ratios so that you can identify, are there huge peaks and valleys and wide swings, right? Wide variability. Now, the green line here is showing if I average it over 3 sprints, okay, it stabilizes this, and you do begin to see an interesting pattern. Even though this team is swinging up and down, over time, they are showing an improvement, okay? And right over here, they're actually beginning to show above 100% predictability. So that means that while once in a while they have a bad sprint, they're beginning to get pretty good. I will generally create an Excel spreadsheet like this that includes both the individual percent completes as well as the trend. And I use this a lot of times to help talk to the team so that their morale does not crash and they can see that, yes, all the work that we're doing is beginning to help. We just need to be aware of why we have these periodic bad sprints. So what is churn? I mentioned this previously. Churn is the amount of change that happens within the sprint. In other words, unplanned stories that are adopted during the sprint and the stories that are taken out during the sprint. That's right. I actually include both. Churn indicates that the team is given a certain body of work to do. They agree to it. They commit to it. But something's happening, and whatever they had worked on in their backlog refinement and the sprint planning. They did some design work on it. They might have written some test cases, etc. All of a sudden, that work is pulled out and something else is put in. This might be an indication of a product owner who can't plan properly, stakeholders that are changing the scope. It might mean that there's a lot of production support work that's causing the team to stop what they're doing, and we need to find a solution. Churn is a very good metric to measure. It's not something you're generally taught in your certified Scrum Master course. We started using it because we noticed that we had problems and we needed to measure it so we could start to solve the problem. You'll notice this is an actual team. Sprint 18, they had 0 churn. Sprint 19, they had 96% churn. Then they had 37%, 26%, then 15%, and it started to restore. But there for about 3 sprints, there was a significant amount of change that was going on, and it was putting a lot of stress on the team, and it also decreased their predictability. As you can imagine, if you change 100% of your scope after the sprint starts, the odds are really good you're not going to succeed. They probably should have failed the sprint and start over, but they didn't. Now, there's a story behind this that I don't have time to give you. Let's just say that the product owner ultimately was fired, and we discovered that she was somewhat unethical. All right? Enough said. Now remember, velocity measures effort and risk, volume of work, unknowns, complexity, knowledge, and skills needed to get it done, but it doesn't measure value. Now this made me wonder, could we measure value by calculating sprint goal achievement trends? I'm sure that you're aware that every sprint there should be a sprint goal. Some teams don't use them, but according to Scrum, they really should. I think it's a good idea. The sprint goal is essentially a business outcome that we want. And what you want to be able to determine is, did we achieve that outcome? So what I came up with the idea was, well, let's create a way, a mechanism by which we measure each sprint, how much of that sprint goal we accomplished. So for example, if the sprint goal is enable the registration, at the end of the sprint, the product owner should be able to look at it and say, we completed it entirely. You got 100% score. Mission accomplished. But you could also say, well, in this case, you got most of it, but there's a few acceptance criteria that didn't work out right. So I'm going to give you about a 75% score. So you got 75% of that goal. The product owner sets the goal. At the sprint review, the product owner could determine how much of the goal was accomplished. And then you could record this in your Excel, sprint over sprint, to see how well you're doing. Now you can track this as a trend by doing this sprint over sprint. So for example, here we had enable registration. Let's say we completed 80%. And then we added some billing preferences. That was our goal for the next sprint. And you got 88%. And then the next one, enable the search. All right, that was another business goal, 88%. You see what I'm doing here? I'm showing overall what is the trend? How well does the team accomplish the sprint goals? This actually would focus on the value, right? And without having to calculate dollars and return on investment or anything like that, it's just focused on the value that the product owner says we need to get this. This is our outcome that we want. This concept is actually very similar to what Scaled Agile Framework uses for the PI performance and predictability. What they essentially do is every quarter they have what they call a program increment. That's a release. And so they set several business objectives that they want to try and accomplish. And they give each one of those a different value, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 points, whatever, however they want to set up that score. They could use Fibonacci if they wanted to. And then at the end of the program increment, at the end of the quarter, the product owner determines how much did you deliver on each one of these. It can be a whole value, or it could be a partial value. Then when you measure at the end of the PI for every team, you can say this team got 80% or 85% or 90% of the business objectives that we had targeted. You can also sum together those business outcomes, that predictability across all of the teams on the release train. And that gives you the ART predictability measure that you see over here. And you'll notice that they're tracking this as a trend as well. Not all companies do this. In fact, this is a very safe, scaled agile concept. I think it was introduced elsewhere as well, but most Scrum organizations don't use this. But this is actually a very, very effective mechanism to differentiate between velocity, which measures effort, and a way of focusing on business outcomes, which measure value. That's why I said we should probably be doing something similar at the sprint level with the sprint goal, right? Following the same model. Okay, now let's try and wind this thing down here. So remember, metric abuse is almost a sin. These metrics should be used to get insights. They're used to forecast, observe trends, and drive improvement, continuous improvement. If you weaponize the metrics, it's going to come back to get you. Don't do that. You will be sorry. All right, there will be other videos coming up on other metrics. I look forward to seeing you there. See you later.